Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new revenge stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, Karen and Her Daughter with Flat Tire. Cast of people, me equals obvious, snobby lady equals Karen, ignorant girl equals daughter, short backstory. This happened years ago when I was still young and strong and thought people were nice and should be helped if I could. I was on my way to school, a JR college in a small city in Idaho. And as I was going down the road I saw a car with a flat tire and two women trying to use a jack upside down. So knew they didn't know what they were doing, so I pulled over and asked if they needed help. After the spare was on the car and before the lug nuts were tight, Karen started in on my about how I must be really proud of myself thinking that they could not do the tire by themselves. Then daughter started in calling me a male chauvinist pig and a few other good terms. All the while they were berating me, I was removing the tire I had installed and put the flat one back on and tightened the lug nuts up as tight as I could. I had been working prior in the mines of the area and was used to lifting 100+ pounds several times an hour, so was fairly stout, so the lugs were not coming loose easily. I then let the jack back down and took the base off and set the whole thing down and started walking back to my truck as they too realized that the tire was flat and I had put the bad one back on. As they asked me to correct that, I just looked at them and told them maybe you make sure the job is done before you start calling people names and that the kindness of someone's heart does have limitations. I drove off knowing that those lugs were not coming off easily and had no feelings of shame or sorrow for what I did. The next one is titled, Try to Get Our Fence Taken Down? Enjoy life without a pool. I grew up in a bit of a strict state and the town I lived in was pretty into everyone's business. Please remember this detail a bit later since it's going to play a very vital role in my story. When I moved to the house I grew up in, we had neighbours who lived in a house right next to our backyard but technically on a different street. This fact will also play a vital role. For this story, we're going to call the neighbours the Murrays. The Murrays seemed nice when we first met. I played with their daughter since she was close to a year younger than me and their son who was 5 years older than me. And their dad became friendly with my dad since it was an extra hand to help with major construction projects. We were friendly enough that when we wouldn't play in my backyard, we'd let the children and their friends or family play there. However, as the years went on we started to see their true colors. Anytime I would get a major item like a guitar or a dune buggy, even getting a major role in the school play, their daughter would try to copy me, such as getting a dirt bike or a guitar and join the drama club, only to quit when seeing how much work was in it. The dad would borrow my dad's woodworking tools and never return them. The mother had a few screws loose and I remember bringing an art kit over only for it to be banned since it made a mess. The brother probably was the only decent one in the family but had some of his own issues. That's a different story. And they developed a hatred for my mother when they discovered her religious heritage. They were friends also with a girl who was very into Hitler's regime, so you can catch my drift on where this is going. Now here's where the revenge story comes in. I was in my backyard driving my dune buggy and just refreshing some dirt tracks for the spring. I was about 12 at the time. I noticed a party going on at my neighbor's house. It turned out to be it was their daughter's 12th birthday party. I remember we gave her a gift to celebrate it, but I wasn't invited. I told my parents and they were upset. Mainly because we bought her a nice gift for her birthday, and the fact that her family didn't have the decency to invite me made my family livid, especially my dad. My parents confronted the Murrays, who apologized and bought me a birthday gift to make up for it since my birthday was in the same month as their daughter's. A few weeks after that occurred, Mrs. Murray had trees put up around the border of our properties so they could have their privacy but still use our land. My dad was furious. One thing about my dad needs to be made clear here, everyone: he's a two-tour combat war veteran with severe PTSD. And when you anger my father to a certain extent, that anger will stay for decades. Since both my parents were sick of their treatment on us, my parents hired a local contractor and had them create a fence to completely fence off our properties. Not even a single door to allow them in our backyard. The Murrays were enraged we did this since it wasn't on Mrs. Murray's terms of privacy and cut their friendship with us. Well, remember when I said I grew up in a town that had their nose in everyone's business? A few days after this, an official from my town paid us a visit and told us they had a report of an illegal fence being made onto our property without proper documentation. My dad knew immediately who called and in the fashion of my dad, showed the official paperwork which was not only 10 years old, but had one major loophole: it never had an expiration date. Because of this, the town official couldn't argue with this and approved there wasn't an issue with the fence. However, right before he left, Dad gave the official a tip on the Murrays since it was them who called on us. Mr. Murray even confirmed he called the town on us weeks later. The tip? The Murrays has a small above-ground pool. One of those crappy build-your-own above-grounds you can buy at your local warehouse store or wherever. Now, as heavily stated, my town had a lot of regulations in order to live there, and if you didn't follow them, they'd be all over you like a bee on sugar until it met the town's standards. My dad always found a way to get what he wanted. And it turns out the Murrays had hedges surrounding the area where their pool was, and Dad tipped the official off that it was actually against town regulations. Lo and behold, Dad was right. Town was all over the Murrays afterwards and told them to either spend the money to get a proper fence in within a month, or tear the pool down. The Murrays were forced to tear their pool down, their only source of outdoor entertainment. Since then, Mr. Murray made up with my dad, but it didn't last long at all. We moved away from that neighborhood 3 years ago and mainly get along with our current neighbors. Last I heard of the Murrays, they stopped talking to Mrs. Murray's sister and her family, who we were also friendly with. The daughter became a prostitute and the son lives with his boyfriend and is an alcoholic. The next one is titled, Mock My Mother's Death. I bankrupt you. My now ex-wife Kate and I moved to an apartment in 2010. The house as a whole a renovated townhouse split between two sides with 2 apartments on the bottom and 2 apartments upstairs. I wasn't the biggest fan of the apartment as it was a much older building that I had ever lived in, but I quickly adjusted to the wood creaking throughout the night. On the initial walkthrough we noticed that the only problem was that there was a dip in the bathroom ceiling. The landlord, Jay, promised he would get fixed as soon as possible. 1 year to the day when we moved in there was a loud crash at 4 a.m. The bathroom ceiling had collapsed and there was tiling and wood all over the floor and in the bathtub. Now Kate was typically the aggressive one, while I was more passive and laid back, and she kept calling Jay throughout the day. When she got in touch with him at around 9 p.m. she explained what happened and insisted that it be fixed immediately. He rebuffed with him yelling that his girlfriend was a lawyer and he didn't need to do anything. Now this is where I got mad. I went outside and called him myself. I feigned a relaxed demeanor and at first he began trying to talk to me as a bro and kept saying, "Dude, I'm gonna get someone out there but it's gonna take a few weeks." When he couldn't sway me that way he began yelling about his girlfriend and her knowing the law. What he was unaware of was that I had read the tenant laws in my state, and so as he tried to lie I waited until he was finished and I recited the law stating that, if an apartment was considered uninhabitable then the landlord needed to pay for the tenant to stay in a place until it was resolved. He tried to say that our upstairs neighbor Phil was the super, but he wasn't sure if he could get down there that night. He put me on hold, then came back a few minutes later and said that Phil and his girlfriend were out of state. I rang Phil's doorbell and asked, with the J on speakerphone, if he was assigned as the super. He laughed and said no. Dejected, he said he would have people out there the next day. Previously he said they were busy for at least 3 weeks. There's more to this incident, but it led to 2 conclusions. 1. If you're going to lie then there has to be a consistency in your lie and make sure that the people you lie to don't communicate with each other. 2. This is where a feud started between me and my Kate versus him and his mother. She was the original landlord and gave the house to him so he could begin to profit. So forward to a year later. Jay stopped coming to the house and his mum began doing the pickups. Around this time my ex and I had been laid off and we were working with Social Security for food, health, and housing insurance. We were approved for all 3 in April, but we would not get the check until May. When our typical check wasn't in the landlord's mailbox, he immediately gave a summons saying that he was taking us to court for eviction. The day we went to court he had no lawyer and, going before the judge, here's the summation: "Judge, does the defense have a means to pay within 90 days of non-payment?" Us: "Yes, Judge." Hands over paperwork showing that he will be paid for April and May. Judge: "I see no problem. They are breaking no laws. Why are we here?" Jay: "Well, Your Honor, they have been bullying." Judge: "I don't care, unless they are breaking a law then this case is dismissed." Suffice it to say Jay and his mothers were not happy. Around this time in my life things were tumultuous. My mother, who had been battling lung cancer, succumbed to it in June. This happened at roughly the same time his mum came knocking looking for payment. I explained that I would leave it in the mailbox when we got back from the funeral home and to please just respect my right to mourn. She took her fingers and began rubbing them together, pretending to play the smallest violin. I will never forget what she said next. "Ooh, my mommy just died. Woe is me. She probably had it coming. I don't care if your entire family is dead. I want my money." She smiled smugly, proud with what she had just said. I saw red and my heart jumped into my throat. I went, grabbed the check, and handed it to her in absolute shock that anyone would say something so ducked up. She had finally managed to push a button that very few people I've known throughout my life have seen. I went into rage mode, but not in the way you would expect. The revenge. We were always told that if a health inspector came by to not open the door. I waited until August. Since that was when the lease was going to run out and we knew they would not extend a renewal. I walked up the block to town hall to ask for a health inspection of our property. It was scheduled for several days later. Now it's important to know several things. 1. I was friends with all of the tenants. Phil had moved out with his fiancée, but the new tenant was Danny upstairs in our side. Tom and Hannah on the other side of the downstairs floor had moved out and Jay was still looking for new tenants. The only one who wanted to stay out of this was Rose on the upper right apartment. 2. I had gotten a key so I could let the inspector in Danny's apartment, and I knew that I could use the back staircase on the right side to let him in on Tom's, now vacant apartment. 3. I also knew that Danny was moving out in September along with Kate and myself. The inspector came and it was glorious. He checked the exterior of the house first, noting that wires were exposed. There was an old empty dryer along with other odd clutter in the backyard. I brought him inside the shared entrance and, as I was counting on, he noticed that the last inspected dated back to 1994, 18 years. This meant that for each year he did not have an inspection there would be appropriate fines. For our apartment we had black mold growing in our bathroom and the bubble in the ceiling had begun to grow to problematic proportions. Upstairs, Danny's apartment was suffering from leaks in the ceiling and it looked like her bathroom ceiling was also on the brink of collapsing. We then went to the basement. The boiler was on the verge of exploding. There were flammable items along with gasoline and a pack of matches sitting right beside it. 2 things that I did not know was 1. The fire door that separated the 2 sides did not close all of the way, rendering it moot, and, on the right basement side there was a toilet. A toilet that had blown up. It had coated the surrounding walls and the leakage prevented us going up to the floor via the right side. The entire time the inspector was photographing and writing constantly. We stepped outside and he said he needed to come back. When I asked why, he said he had run out of space to write down all of the infractions. He had filled the front and had written an entire page on the back portion. I kindly and coyly asked, "Well, how much will it cost right now?" He scratched his head and said, "Around 20 to 30k from what I can see, but it's probably going to be higher as this house was never licensed to be split into apartments." I thanked him and he was going to come back with the county inspector. So we moved out but I got the rundown from Rose. Because he was the current owner he owed all current fines and no one new could not move into the empty apartments until everything was up to code. Because 3 out of 4 were vacant he was losing $4,500 in potential rent. He handed the property back to his mother and had to claim for bankruptcy. Now here's the other thing. Every time an old tenant left and a new one was coming in, an inspection was supposed to be done. Now that all of the financial burden fell on her, they looked into the records and she was fined for each time she had broken that rule, $750 per. By the end of the year Rose had moved out, so the place was hemorrhaging money. I sat back, proud of what I had done, and left it be. I wasn't close to done yet. I felt like I had destroyed Jay, but my real target had always been his mum. I learned that she had about 8 properties throughout 3 towns in my county. I went to each one, spoke to the tenants, and said I was a concerned tenant from another property and asked if they had any problems with their apartments. Every person I asked described the apartment in very poor to intolerable levels and that the mum was effectively a slumlord. She would ignore problems unless someone turned to litigations. She was threatened that they would summon the inspector, or, more often than not, the people would move out. She'd refuse their deposit, and sink those into repairs. People rarely fought back because she knew that the occupants were of upper, lower class minorities. So, being the concerned person I was, I went to the inspector of the other two towns and asked for an inspection to be done with at least one, if not more, would be awaiting the inspector when they came. Turns out that she faced pretty much the same infractions on every apartment she owned. It turned out she actually had 12 apartments, but I initially only knew about the ones that fell within my county. The remaining properties in the next county over were given a heads up for a surprise inspection. From what I can tell, Jay's mum had been in the landlord business for about 35 to 40 years. That collapsed quickly. Since we moved literally one block down the road from our old one, I got to see Jay lose his primary source of income and have to claim bankruptcy. But also saw that his mother was also trying desperately to find a buyer for all of the apartments so she could pay off the fines. I learned 2 years later that she too had to file for bankruptcy. Jay and his mother camped out in front of our next apartment 2 days in October of 13 before she filed for bankruptcy. I'm guessing to scream at me and or Kate, so I called the cops and said that there were strange people standing in a no parking zone and they kept looking up at the second floor. A cruiser swung by and told them to leave. I know I should have used the 2 months I spent monitoring everything to find a new job, but this was the one and only time I wanted to cripple a person where they hurt the most, their wallets. I think I got my point across. None of this would have happened if you had just ducking fixed the ceiling before it collapsed, Jay. The next one is titled, Teaching a Property Officer in a Bank a Lesson in Humility. This happened back in 2012. One of my co-workers fell in love with a ginormous house. 7,000 square feet. 7 bathrooms and 7 bedrooms. 2 full kitchens. Sitting on 2 acres, and the backside butted up against federal land, which means it could never, ever be built on. So his view could never be compromised. In 2008 this property was carried on the tax rolls for $980,000. Then the economy went into a tailspin. The builder, a residential construction company owner, found himself overextended. With the acute slowdown in homebuilding, he could not meet the note on the property. So the bank ended up with it. Fast forward 4 years. The bank had been marketing it the whole time, and found no takers. So by 2012, it was make an offer. So my co-worker went to the bank with an offer of $325,000, contingent on him selling his current home. The bank's property officer literally laughed in his face. Told him that worth at least $600,000, and not a penny less. That the bank would rather let it crumble into dust before accepting his $325,000 offer. Without going into a lot of detail here, it turns out that events happened about this time. The bank found itself having to move over 200 homes and businesses within 60 days, because they suddenly needed some cash. If you were thinking fraud and embezzlement, you'd be correct. So they hired a company to auction off the properties in our state's capital. Which was a bit odd, as it is 250 miles away. But I guess they rolled it into another auction they'd already scheduled. It was a no-reserve price auction. You could start with a bid of $1. So he and I went up there. We knew his house was up for auction, and he'd lined up his financing. From another bank, by the way. Why give them any interest, if this worked? Sure enough, it came up, and there were only 2 people bidding on it. And the second guy dropped out at $295,000. So my buddy bought it for $295,500. Sweet. The property officer was there watching all this. The look on his face was priceless. When it was all said and done, my friend sent a nice letter and a fruit basket to the bank's executive board, thanking them for the $30,000 reduction in price that they'd given him. P.S. He just sold it a couple of months ago, because now he's an empty nester. Got $475,000 for it. So he made about $180,000 for living in it 5 years. Thank you, bank. The last one is titled, Hippity Hoppity, This Is No Longer Your Property to Manage. After graduating college, my girlfriend and I moved to a new state where she was accepted into an engineering program. We found a lovely garden apartment-style complex that advertised 100 megabits per second internet speed included in the price among a few other amenities. When we met the property manager, he seemed strict but well-mannered, nothing out of the ordinary. Until we signed the lease. The first problem, suddenly, walking into his office was not allowed without an appointment. I had come by to ask a question, saw him browsing social media, and figured he was as available as he made himself to us when we first came by, unannounced, to view a model apartment. Nope. He refused to answer my question and asked me to make an appointment via email. The second problem, the terms of our lease included an attachment to complete within 48 hours of accepting the keys that details all discrepancies within the unit. We submitted the attachment via email around the 40th hour. The property manager responded that the terms recently changed from 48 to 24 hours, and since we had passed 24 hours, we would be held liable for all found damages. When citing our copy of the lease, which explicitly stated 48 hours, he informs us that we signed an outdated copy and would need to make an appointment to come by the office and sign a new lease. The third problem, the internet speed was not 100 megabits per second as advertised. It was less than 15 megabits per second off peak and about approximately 5 megabits per second on peak. We again contacted the property manager to complain but were referred to make an appointment. The fourth problem, we made an appointment to address the previous three problems. During this meeting and after I finished voicing our issues, the property manager leans forward and says, "There are other communities in this neighborhood that may be more accepting of people like you and your girlfriend. You're welcome to break the lease and leave. People like you and your girlfriend." I had thought he was referencing our no-nonsense response to his nonsense daily communication, scheduling multiple meetings to address these issues, etc., but my girlfriend believed he was speaking towards our skin colors. Her, a black woman, and myself, a white man. My girlfriend jokingly told me to check my privilege before getting serious and explaining to me that we were experiencing discrimination at the very least. The solution, I did some research and discovered the property manager worked for a larger organization that owned several complexes throughout the country. I found their director of human resources on LinkedIn and made a connection. I then emailed her copies of all email correspondence, screenshots of the lease, pictures of the internet speed flags advertised by the road, and more screenshots of online speed tests. We further noted his comment and the implications behind it. The human resources director replied within a few hours and promised us she would look into the issue. About 2 days later, the property manager called and asked us to come by his office at our convenience. We showed up near the end of the day, and sat down across from him. He then proceeded to ask us if we would be willing to write a letter stating we accepted his apology, despite not yet offering said apology, and in return he would credit us a month's rent, accept our damages attachment, and promise to have the ISP on site within a week to assess the internet issues. We declined. He got personal with us and revealed his job may be at stake and asked us to reconsider. My girlfriend leaned forward and said, "There are other communities in this neighborhood that may be more accepting of people like you. You're welcome to leave." The property manager was replaced in a week with a super sweet older woman who not only gave us all the things the original property manager had promised, the 1-month credit, accepting the damages attachment and then further scheduling maintenance to fix said damages, having the ISP assess and upgrade the internet to promised speeds. But she also made it clear her office was always open for anything we may need. I looked up the old property manager about a few months later on LinkedIn. Still unemployed. Thanks for listening.